a adopté la résolution 2730. Cette résolution réaffirme l'obligation qui incombe aux États et aux parties au conflit de respecter et de protéger le personnel et les biens humanitaires. Ceci s'applique bien sûr aussi aux centres de distribution à Gaza qui ne doivent pas faire l'objet de pillages, comme nous venons de l'entendre. Nous rappelons aussi que l'usage de la force lors d'opérations de maintien de l'ordre, comme à Jenin la semaine passée, doit notamment répondre aux critères de nécessité et de proportionnalité et protéger les droits de tout individu à la vie et à la sécurité de sa personne. Pour conclure, la Suisse rappelle que le respect du droit international et des résolutions de ce Conseil sont les conditions sine qua non pour la désescalade et un premier pas vers la mise en place d'une paix durable entre Israéliens et Palestiniens. Nous réitérons notre soutien ferme à la solution négociée à deux États, Israël et la Palestine, dont Gaza fait partie intégrante, et vivant côte à côte en paix et en sécurité à l'intérieur de frontières sûres et reconnues. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. Malta is gravely concerned at the crisis that continues to unfold. We reaffirm our call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Malta reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of the 7th October Hamas terror attack on Israeli civilians and the continued indiscriminate rocket fire at Israeli territory, including the recent barrage launched from Rafah. We once again call for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages. Our concerns also continue to mount for Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Tens of thousands have already been killed or injured. Millions have been forcibly displaced on multiple occasions, and the entire population is under siege. An intensification of Israeli military operations in Rafah and a return to fierce fighting in North Gaza, coupled with evacuation orders imposed on desperate civilians, highlights the severely compromised security and humanitarian crisis. On Sunday, more civilians lost their lives and were harmed following an Israeli airstrike on a refugee camp in Rafah. The constant bombardment of hospitals, combined with aid restrictions, has led to the collapse of the healthcare system. This is putting the lives of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians at risk as they are unable to access essential services. This is also putting mothers and their newborns at risk of significant physical and mental harm. More than 155,000 pregnant and lactating women are unable to access essential services. Reports of an estimated 17,000 children are currently unaccompanied or separated from their families. This is staggering. We stress that international humanitarian law provides special protection for children as persons who are particularly vulnerable. The seizure and closure of the Rafah crossing by Israel has also crippled the provision and distribution of aid, compounding an already dire situation. In accordance with international humanitarian law, Israel is obliged to facilitate unimpeded aid relief into and across the Gaza Strip. We call for the Rafah crossing to be reopened and for a massive upscale of aid to the civilian population. The safety and security of aid workers, in accordance with Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720, must equally be guaranteed. Furthermore, Malta underlines its support for the indispensable life-saving role of UNRWA in Gaza and the wider region. Consistent with our endorsement of the shared commitments on UNRWA, we stress the need for the agency to receive adequate and sustained political and financial support. President, the immediate priorities are clear. We need full compliance and implementation of the relevant Council resolutions and the full, immediate and effective implementation of the orders of the ICJ, including those issued on 24th May. We need a ceasefire, the release of hostages, a surge of humanitarian aid, and a stop to the launch of rockets on Israeli towns and cities. We must also address the question of long-term priorities to ensure that Israelis and Palestinians both enjoy a future of peace and dignity. This includes a commitment to accountability, as justice and peace are complementary. Judicial proceedings seeking to counter impunity are critical for long-term stability. We reaffirm that settlements in the West Bank are illegal and an obstacle for peace. Israeli settlement activities and violence against Palestinian civilians in the OPT must cease. Fundamentally, influential and regional parties must mobilize the political will and encourage to support restorative dialogue processes and ensure that a return to a political horizon is reaffirmed as a priority. This must include support to revitalize the Palestinian Authority, for it to have the capacity for governance over both the West Bank and Gaza. Malta supports all efforts towards initiating a comprehensive peace plan, which would pave the way for a credible and irreversible realization of a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states living side by side in peace and security, in line with all relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Monsieur Wennesland pour son exposé et je tiens à lui redire le plein soutien de la France. La France appelle à un cessez-le-feu immédiat à Gaza. Elle réaffirme son opposition à l'opération militaire israélienne en cours à Rafah, qui a conduit au déplacement de centaines de milliers de civils. Celle-ci doit cesser sans délai. Le président Macron a exprimé lundi son indignation après les récentes frappes israéliennes qui ont fait de nombreuses victimes civiles. Conformément à l'ordonnance de la Cour internationale de justice, Israël doit arrêter immédiatement son offensive militaire et toute autre action menée dans le gouvernorat de Rafah. Les autorités israéliennes doivent aussi maintenir ouvert le point de passage de Rafah pour que puisse être assurée sans restriction et à grande échelle la fourniture des services de base et de l'aide humanitaire requis de toute urgence. La France exige la libération immédiate de tous les otages encore retenus par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes. Elle déplore le décès de l'un des 3 otages français. La France n'a cessé de condamner les attaques terroristes du 7 octobre. Elle condamne également les tirs de roquettes du Hamas ayant ciblé la semaine dernière la région de Tel Aviv et le centre d'Israël. Il est essentiel qu'une aide humanitaire massive parvienne à la population civile de Gaza. Tous les points de passage doivent être ouverts sans délai. La France condamne fermement l'attaque du Hamas contre le point de passage de Kerem Shalom, ainsi que les attaques d'un convoi humanitaire jordanien par des colons israéliens le 7 mai. Nous appelons les autorités israéliennes à mettre fin à la violence des colons contre les convois d'aide et à traduire les auteurs en justice. Nous rappelons aussi que l'acheminement de l'aide ne doit pas être entravé et qu'elle doit bénéficier à la population civile. La France appelle à un strict respect du droit international humanitaire et elle rappelle l'impératif de protection des civils et des personnels humanitaires. Elle a utilisé le corridor maritime pour fournir de l'aide aux populations civiles de Gaza. Mais ce corridor ne peut se substituer à l'acheminement de l'aide par les voies terrestres. Comme l'a fait la Cour internationale de justice, la France appelle Israël à rouvrir immédiatement le point de passage de Rafah. La France est très préoccupée par la situation en Cisjordanie et plus largement dans la région. Nous déplorons les conséquences de l'opération militaire menée dans le camp de réfugiés de Jénine. La France rappelle l'importance du respect du principe de distinction entre la population civile et les combattants. La politique de colonisation israélienne en Cisjordanie et à Jérusalem-Est, contraire au droit international, se poursuit à un rythme soutenu. Le président Macron a condamné les nouvelles annonces en matière de colonisation et la remise en cause de la loi de désengagement. Et il a souligné sa détermination à renforcer les sanctions en la matière, y compris au niveau européen. La France condamne les violences commises par certains colons à l'encontre de la population palestinienne. Ceux-ci doivent répondre de leurs actes devant la justice. La France est mobilisée pour éviter un embrasement régional. Nous appelons à la désescalade, notamment de part et d'autre de la ligne bleue. Monsieur le Président, le Conseil de sécurité a déjà adopté 3 résolutions sur l'arrêt des combats et l'acheminement de l'aide humanitaire. Celles-ci ont valeur contraignante et elles doivent être respectées. Ce Conseil doit s'exprimer de manière urgente sur la situation à Rafah et demander l'arrêt de cette offensive. Il doit aussi œuvrer à la solution des 2 États, qui est la seule à même de donner un horizon de paix aux Israéliens comme aux Palestiniens. La France continuera de se mobiliser en ce sens auprès de ses partenaires internationaux et du groupe de contact arabe que le président de la République et le ministre des Affaires étrangères ont reçu à Paris le 24 mai. Le président Macron a rappelé à cette occasion le soutien de la France à une autorité palestinienne renforcée et à son retour dans la bande de Gaza, qui devra faire partie de l'État palestinien avec le soutien de la communauté internationale. Les Nations unies ont un rôle central à jouer en ce sens. Le projet de résolution que nous proposons aborde ces dimensions politiques et j'appelle l'ensemble des membres du Conseil de sécurité à le soutenir. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, благодарим специального координатора по БВУ господина Тура Венеслана за обзор ситуации в зоне Палестино-израильского конфликта, где уже 8-й месяц продолжается кровопролитная военная операция Израиля, унесшая уже более 36,5 тысяч мирных палестинцев. Беспрецедентное со времен Второй мировой войны количество жертв. Абсолютное большинство среди них составляют женщины и дети, которые погибают в поисках жизненно необходимой помощи в недоступных для ООНовских структур районах анклава. Вопреки резолюциям Совета Безопасности и Генеральной Ассамблеи ООН, а также решениям Международного суда ООН, израильская авиация продолжает неизбирательные бомбардировки южных и центральных районов Газы. Не избежал этой трагической участи и город Рафах на юге сектора, где
where approximately 1 million civilians have massed after, according to UNRWA data, some 800,000 Palestinians left it. Every single day people are dying, including UN personnel. On 13th of May, as a result of a strike against a UN vehicle which was driving towards a European hospital in Rafah, a staff member of the United Nations Department of Staff and Safety and Security was killed, as well as another one was wounded. In the night of the 26th of May, as a result of an attack by the Israeli Air Force in an IDP tent camp in the northwest of Rafah, at least 45 people were killed, including small children. Dozens were wounded. This happened just 2 days after yet another ruling of the International Court of Justice about provisional measures with a demand to stop the assault against Rafah. Furthermore, at the Rafah border crossing, as a result of a firefight between Israeli soldiers and Egyptian border guards, an Egyptian soldier was killed. Israeli actions in Rafah have been condemned by an absolute majority of members of the international community, including heads of foreign ministries of the Arab countries. The Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, has also spoken out. He called on Israel to conduct a thorough investigation to determine those responsible and to take urgent measures to ensure the protection of the civilian population. We, in turn, condemn the airstrike against the IDP camp in Rafah and call Israel to put an end to these war crimes against the Palestinian people. We demand that Israel strictly adhere to provisions of international humanitarian law. Attacks against the UN personnel, against humanitarian workers working on the ground are unacceptable. We support the appeal of Antonio Guterres to an immediate ceasefire and ensuring unimpeded humanitarian access and unconditional release of all hostages to put an end to the suffering of the civilian population of the enclave. Mr. President, based on the views expressed by the Special Coordinator, it's clear that we shouldn't expect the Israeli military machine to stop its actions anytime soon. We see that Israel intends to continue its military operation in Gaza in spite of the increasing obvious inability to achieve the declared aims, a safe return of hostages and the destruction of Hamas. At the same time, the negotiating process between Israel and Hamas through mediators on the issue of exchanging Israeli hostages for Palestinian prisoners is stalled. In these conditions, the scale of the humanitarian disaster is increasing every single day. The Israeli army has been blocking for 3 weeks the entry through Rafah border crossing and Kerem Shalom border crossing, the entry of 3,000 trucks with humanitarian assistance. As a result, according to estimates of UN specialized agencies, the sector has run out of all humanitarian assistance. There's no water, no food, and no fuel. Those who manage to flee the shelling have to confront famine, infectious diseases, and the absence of necessary medical assistance. Now, there was quite a public outcry about reports on the discovery of mass graves in Han Yunis containing some 300 bodies of Palestinians. The Russian Federation is doing everything it can to ease the dire situation of the civilian population of the occupied territories. Starting on 19th of October of 2023, aircraft from the Ministry of Emergency Services of Russia has delivered over 500 tons of humanitarian cargo to Egypt through the Egyptian Red Crescent. In addition to government bodies, various Russian NGOs and associations and individuals and others have joined the efforts to collect humanitarian assistance for Palestinians. This has led to the collection of hundreds of tons of medication, warm clothing, tents, food, and basic necessities to be sent to the conflict zone. Mr. President, we unfortunately have to conclude that in conditions of the current escalation, returning the Palestinian-Israeli peace process towards a diplomatic political sphere and establishing a ceasefire appears quite illusory. In this connection, the UN Security Council must continue to put pressure on Israel as well as on its ally, the United States, which signed into law a bill allocating military assistance to the tune of $26.4 billion to Israel. This step, against the backdrop of providing the necessary financing to UNRWA, has led to a growing rejection and outrage within the United States, where anti-Israeli demonstrations have spread to the campuses of most major universities. At the same time, attempts by the Israelis to hype up and publicize the topic of sexual violence and the supposed involvement of UNRWA staff in the Hamas attack of the 7th of October have backfired. After a visit to Israel and the West Bank, the special representative of the Secretary General, in their report, was not able to confirm the most vile accusations by Israel. However, she did find multiple violations against arbitrarily detained Palestinians. We also note the conclusions of the group of experts headed by Catherine Colonna, which confirmed that UNRWA has adhered to the principle of neutrality and also played a key role in providing assistance to Palestinians. Mr. President, the current worsening of the situation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict demonstrates what tragic consequences are caused by the United States in its attempt to monopolize mediation functions to satisfy its unjustified ambitions to solve all global problems alone. At the same time, the Americans are blocking any attempts by the international community to try to find ways to resolve the Middle East conflict and to correct the historical injustice against Palestinians. Among these steps are a veto by the United States of the Security Council, a draft resolution recommending to the General Assembly to accept Palestine as a member of the UN. We welcome efforts of our Algerian partners in the Council to promote in the Council a document against a backdrop of the continuing bloodshed. We believe it's important, as soon as possible, to send a unified signal by the Council in favor of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Furthermore, we would like to once again confirm our unchanged position on the need to, alongside measures to overcome the acute phases of this crisis, to start laying the groundwork for a direct dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis on the whole range of issues of the final status. The outcome of this process should be the implementation of the two-state formula approved by the international community, Israel and Palestine coexisting in peace and security in the borders of 1967. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their important statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Coordinator Mr. Venestran for his informative briefing. As we approach almost 8 months since the gruesome acts of terror by Hamas and others, we must uphold our strong condemnation of those actions while calling for the immediate return of all remaining hostages. At the same time, we must recognize the ongoing horrors and hostilities in Gaza. We are bearing witness to unimaginable suffering, catastrophic levels of civilian casualties, and starvations and disease on the rise. There is no safe place in Gaza Strip, not even for aid workers, journalists, women, or children. Despite the strong calls from the international community for restraint, Israel has begun military operations in Rafah. As humanitarian agencies had warned, the impact has already been devastating. Around 1 million Palestinians have been forced to flee yet again, most to areas that are not fit for human habitation. While we recognize the activation of the 2720 UN mechanism, the Rafah crossing is currently not functional, depriving civilians of the primary means of getting aid into Gaza. Famine has already taken hold in the north, and the situation in the south is on the brink of collapse, while the Rafah crossing stops functioning and the people are forced to displace. Against this background, the International Court of Justice has issued another provisional measures last week that ordered Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah, which may bring about physical destruction of the Palestinians in Gaza. Orders of provisional measures of the ICJ are legally binding on the parties to disputes and to be observed in good faith. Japan is deeply concerned for the critical humanitarian situation in Gaza, as well as the Israel Defense Forces airstrikes in Rafah and other military operations entailing a large number of civilian facilities, including many women and children. We cannot accept so many innocent people, especially women and children, fall victim to the fighting. As our Foreign Minister Kamikawa Yoko conveyed to Israel's Foreign Minister earlier this week, Japan opposes a full-scale military operation in Rafah and reiterates that humanitarian activities, including through the Rafah crossing, should not be impeded. Mr. President, Japan also joins others in calling for an immediate ceasefire so that the conducive environment for unhindered humanitarian activities is ensured and the hostages are released, and sincerely hopes that this will lead to a sustainable ceasefire. We strongly support the negotiations led by Egypt, Qatar, and the US seeking a way out of this devastating crisis. Beyond Gaza, Japan deplores the violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where over 480 Palestinians have been killed since October 7th. We also unequivocally condemn the arson of UNRWA's headquarters. An environment in which international organizations can execute their missions safely and effectively is essential. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for the important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Special Coordinator Venesland for his briefing. Mr. President, in the recent weeks, this Council has been clear in its rejection of the operation in Rafah. In our most recent resolution 2728, we made a clear demand for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, together with the release of all hostages and ensuring safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access. Last week, the International Court of Justice adopted a new order on provisional measures regarding Gaza. Among others, the court has clearly ordered Israel to immediately hold its military offensive in Rafah. The court ordered to maintain open the Rafah crossing. The court ordered to ensure, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale of basic services and humanitarian assistance. Despite this order, the operation continues with even more intensity. Security Council resolutions and ICJ decisions are binding. Yet, as we are meeting today, the operation in Rafah continues, despite international community's demands and pleas to the contrary, and in defiance of the order of the ICJ. Early this week, we saw a heartbreaking evidence of why the operations must stop immediately. Our worst fears of the severe impact of the operation on civilian populations have come true. Slovenia once again firmly condemns the strike on the displaced persons in Rafah, in what was supposed to be a safe zone. It proved once again that no place is a safe place for the civilians in Gaza. We reject forced displacement. We are appalled by the humanitarian conditions for internally displaced in Gaza. 1 million people was once again displaced from Rafah in the past few weeks. Clearly, there are not enough resources to respond to humanitarian needs, in particular food, water, fuel, medicine, and shelter. We are talking about people, old, young, children. People who, instead of fulfilling their dreams and aspirations, face nothing but struggles. For many of them, there is only one dream left: to wake up tomorrow. We have been consistently briefed about mounting struggles of people in the West Bank, further aggravated by the deteriorating fiscal situation of the Palestinian Authority. We are deeply concerned about the challenges faced by UNRWA, including the vote of the new legislation in the Knesset. Mr. President, international law is not a menu to choose from. It is also not something pushed on us. It is something we have willingly signed up to and accepted. UN member states must uphold the UN Charter with an unwavering commitment to international law. That means full respect of international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. It means respect for decisions of international courts. It also means ensuring accountability for grave violations of international law. The decisions by the ACJ are not guidance and they are not recommendations. They are obligations. They are binding. Mr. President, it is important to underline that the most recent strike on displaced camp in Rafah is not an isolated incident. There have been several incidents in Gaza, and in one case after the other, we were told that investigations were taking place. However, this Council has not received any information or to follow up. In order for the Council to act responsibly in preventing the violations and ensuring accountability, we need to know what is happening on the ground. Credible international investigations are best fit for this purpose. The Council itself must show an unwavering commitment to international law by stepping up to its responsibilities. By merely observing grave violations, we are allowing the international system we know, the one based on the respect for international law, to collapse in front of our eyes. It is time for the Council to stop observing the situation in Rafah. The tragedy is not imminent. It is happening. And we should act, including with a clear resolution. Mr. President, like everything else, one day this moment will be history, and we will be judged on the basis of our reaction to it. The Council must make sure to be on the right side of history, and for Slovenia, the right side of history is protection of civilians. And we once again call for the immediate ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you. I'm grateful to the Special Coordinator, Tor Venesland, for his briefing this morning. And once again, I'd like to reiterate the support of Ecuador for his valuable efforts since the terrorist attacks carried out by Hamas on the 7th of October of last year, that once again we unequivocally condemn. This Council has repeatedly heard briefings that speak of terrifying violence, death, wounded, displaced, pain for the population of Palestine and Israel. Mr. President, just in the past few days, there have been various discouraging news that have come to us, especially since from Gaza. Bombings that gravely affect the civilian population in Rafah and lead to tens of deaths and wounded, unending fighting, insufficient humanitarian assistance, rocket attacks by Hamas indiscriminately against Israel. The images that have reached us this weekend from Tal al-Sultan are difficult to forget. It's time to put an end to the cycle of violence and suffering. Colleagues, on the 20th of May, I stated that the situation is increasingly complex, and I recall the obligation of implementing all the resolutions of this Council as well as the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice. Today, after the International Court of Justice has decided on new provisional measures and the situation of Rafah has become even more violent, I must reiterate what I said and once again make an appeal so that the decisions that have been taken by relevant United Nations organs are complied with, in order to immediately cease hostilities and for humanitarian assistance to be delivered in a safe, sufficient, and timely way to all those who need it, and so that the hostages that continue to be in the hands of Hamas should be released immediately and unconditionally. I must recall also that the norms of international humanitarian law are incumbent on all parties, and that their violation leads to very grave responsibility. The relevant investigations must be conducted that make it possible to achieve that appropriate accountability. Mr. President, it's necessary to renew negotiations between the parties that lead to a ceasefire and the release of hostages. It's also very important for these negotiations to take place in good faith. My country supports and is grateful for the mediation efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, and urges the parties to be as flexible as possible in order to reach a viable arrangement as soon as it becomes possible. Actors that have the ability to influence the parties have a responsibility to exert that influence urgently and decisively, and this Council must also make its voice heard in the face of a situation that has gone beyond all possible limits. It's also necessary to work to make sure that this is the last war in this conflict. For this, it's important to create the conditions that make it possible to move towards a peaceful, negotiated, definitive, and just solution for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, based on the 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, Guyana thanks Special Coordinator Wensland for his briefing on the ever-worsening crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory. Another meeting on the Palestinian question. Another list of statements calling for an end to this war. A sense of helplessness envelopes this small elected member of the Council in the face of the dehumanization of a people, disregard for the rule of law, and impunity. When will it end? Who and what can make it end? And yet, we cannot afford to remain silent, as too many have been already tragically silenced forever in this war. And so at the outset, I express Guyana's strong solidarity with the Palestinian people, a people with a rich history, culture, and a land. It is perhaps one of the greatest tragedies of modern times that the desire for their homeland has brought so much cruel suffering to the Palestinian people. A greater tragedy, though, is that the United Nations has not yet been able to bring this injustice to an end. Mr. President, it has been 76 years since the Palestinian people were forcibly displaced from much of their homeland, despite the United Nations General Assembly adopting a plan for the creation of an Arab and a Jewish state as a settlement of the Palestinian question. Force and displacement have characterized the Palestinian existence from that time to now, as they have experienced cycle after cycle of violence, pushing them off their ever-shrinking homeland. Where they have been allowed to remain, their existence has been one most miserable, owing to the iron fist of the occupying power that reaches into every sphere of Palestinian life. Today marks 235 days of the latest cycle of violence, and words are inadequate to capture the devastating results. The death toll has surpassed 36,000. More than 80,000 have been physically injured. Once the rubble in Gaza is cleared, the death toll is expected to climb. Against this backdrop of death and injury, the healthcare system has been severely incapacitated. Medical supplies, as with other humanitarian essentials, are extremely limited owing to the lack of humanitarian access at scale. The level of food insecurity has led to full-blown famine in the north. The impact of the war on children is especially disturbing. Many of them have been killed, maimed, and orphaned. The long-term psychosocial impacts on these children is a particular source of concern. Mr. President, it had seemed that the Gaza crisis could not get any worse until we learned of last Sunday's events in Tal al-Sultan in Rafah, where displaced Palestinians sheltering in tents were set on fire after Israeli airstrikes. People were injured and burned alive, and all of this in a designated safe zone, a chilling reminder that there is no safe place in Gaza. Guyana calls for a swift, independent, and international investigation to establish the facts surrounding this incident, including to identify the perpetrators. This Council must not continue to accept the all too familiar explanations of these incidents being mistakes or miscalculations. There is no justification for the killing of innocent civilians, and the Geneva Conventions of 1949 are clear on the obligation to protect civilians. This leads me to emphasize the obligation of all parties to the conflict to adhere strictly to international law, including international humanitarian law. The ICJ has issued 3 sets of provisional measures, but there is no compliance. Indeed, 2 days had not yet passed following the last order by the court for Israel to halt military operations in Rafah, when the attack in Tal al-Sultan took place. This Council must seriously consider how to address this blatant disregard for the rule of law. In this quagmire of illegalities, there are still more than 100 persons in Gaza taken hostage by Hamas from Israel on 7th of October. They must be immediately and unconditionally released, and their welfare must be protected. In light of the foregoing, Guyana makes three important calls. First, we call again for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza and for the removal of all obstacles that are contributing to the suffering of the Palestinian people. Unless the violence ends, the humanitarian situation will not improve and the suffering will continue. A ceasefire is also one critical element for improving the security situation for humanitarian personnel to operate unimpeded. Second, we call for the opening of all land routes into Gaza to improve the flow of humanitarian goods. The needs in Gaza are massive, and the non-operation of several crossings has rendered the humanitarian response ineffective. The Rafah crossing must be reopened, unwieldy verification processes must be corrected, and Gaza must be flooded with humanitarian aid. Commercial activity must be fully resumed, even as we acknowledge that many have been pauperized by this war. Third, Guyana demands serious long-term efforts towards achieving the two-state solution. The Palestinian people must exercise their inalienable right to self-determination, and it is the United Nations that must guarantee the exercise of that right. The majority of the organization's membership has demonstrated its support for Palestinian self-determination and statehood, and it is therefore this Council's responsibility to honor the wishes of the Palestinian people in this regard. This is also the most viable way to address many of the dimensions of the Palestinian question, including the unresolved refugee problem, which necessitates a continued mandate for UNRWA. Guyana takes this opportunity to reiterate its unwavering support for UNRWA and is deeply concerned about moves to designate it as a terrorist organization. We reject this move. Mr. President, in closing, Guyana is prepared to work with this Council to accomplish peace for Palestinians and Israelis. Contrary to the strategy embraced by some, peace cannot come from violence and war. Neither can security be spawned from insecurity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. Almost 8 months have passed since the outbreak of the conflict in Gaza, as the siege and attacks on civilians continue and the unprecedented humanitarian disaster intensifies. The people of Gaza are deeply mired in despair, and the situation has long been precarious. Allowing the fighting in Gaza to continue will only deepen the humanitarian catastrophe and plunge the entire region into greater turmoil. The international community, UN Security Council in particular, must take further actions to promote an immediate ceasefire, save lives, and alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. For some time now, the international community has been closely following the situation in Rafah and has repeatedly called for an immediate ceasefire. The Security Council has discussed it many times and has explicitly issued a strong signal that attacks on Rafah must stop. The International Court of Justice issued an order on provisional measures demanding Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah in accordance with the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. However, despite the strong opposition of the international community, Israel bombed more than a dozen IDP camps in Gaza, resulting in the death of a large number of innocent civilians. China strongly condemns this. China supports the draft resolution circulated by Algeria yesterday, which responds to the overwhelming call of the international community and represents the minimum action the Council should take at this time. We hope all members will put aside political calculations, prioritize saving lives, and support its adoption by the Council as soon as possible. Concrete actions must be taken to ease the humanitarian disaster in Gaza and the Rafah crossing. On the one side, more than 2,000 trucks loaded with humanitarian supplies are anxiously waiting for access, while on the other side are millions of people struggling with hunger, sickness, and despair. Relief may seem to be close at hand, but it is out of reach because of artificial barriers. China firmly opposes the politicization of humanitarian issues, the use of hunger as a weapon, and the use of humanitarian assistance as a bargaining chip. Israel should effectively implement its obligations as the occupying power by immediately opening all land crossings, ensuring adequate and expeditious access for humanitarian supplies, the safety of humanitarian agencies and personnel, and the safe and orderly distribution of humanitarian supplies. The repeated attacks on UNRWA's facility in the West Bank must be thoroughly investigated, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. The fundamental solution to the Middle East question is the implementation of the two-state solution. It is the long-cherished dream of the Palestinians to create an independent state, and the historical injustice they have suffered should not be perpetuated. China calls for greater international and regional diplomatic efforts to reshape the credible multilateral process and revitalize the political prospects for the two-state solution. China proposes the convening of a larger-scale, more authoritative, and more effective international peace conference with a timetable and a roadmap for the implementation of the two-state solution. We support Palestine's full UN membership at an early date. President, the 10th Ministerial Conference of the China Arab States Cooperation Forum will be held in Beijing tomorrow. The leaders of Bahrain, Egypt, Tunisia, and the UAE are currently visiting China. China will continue in-depth discussions on the question of Palestine with the leaders and foreign ministers of the Arab countries who are visiting China and participating in the conference, and will make our common voice heard. The goal is to end the conflict in Gaza as soon as possible and to achieve peace, while for the international community to implement the two-state solution with greater determination and more concrete actions so as to bring about lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Coordinator Tor Wensland for his detailed briefing on the ongoing catastrophe in Gaza and alarming developments in the West Bank. Now the world is watching with grave concern the expanding ground operations in Rafah. Around 1 million Palestinian civilians in Rafah have been forcibly displaced once again. However, nowhere is safe in Gaza. Israel claims that the killing of dozens of civilians last weekend in tents in a so-called safe zone in western Rafah was a tragic mistake. But when such incidents are repeated again and again, and the children and the aid workers keep being killed, it would be difficult for anybody to regard them as just mistakes. We call on Israel to immediately halt its offensive in Rafah. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is even worsening than before, as the delivery of humanitarian aid throughout Gaza has been seriously hindered or nearly blocked. The Rafah crossing has been closed for almost a month, and the shooting incident that killed an Egyptian soldier on Monday shows tensions are growing, further destabilizing regional peace and security and crossing the red lines of neighboring countries. It is unfortunately innocent civilians that are dying from a lack of aid, as concerned countries are finger-pointing at each other regarding the malfunctioning of both the Rafah and Karam Shalom crossings. The maritime corridor had been providing a semblance of hope. We appreciate the efforts by relevant countries, including the US and Cyprus. However, it is regrettable that the maritime corridor had not achieved its goal yet due to an inability to distribute inside Gaza and damage of the pier by bad weather. It is also regrettable that the launching of the new mechanism under Resolution 2720 was obstructed before its full implementation by coinciding with the beginning of the Israeli ground operation into Rafah on May 7th. We recall that Israel made a set of commitments just 2 months ago, following the World Central Kitchen killings, to expand humanitarian aid through various means. We believe these commitments were made in good faith and are still valid, yet have seen no results to this end. Rather, we have witnessed a drastic decrease in the volume of humanitarian aid into Gaza since May 7th, at the very same time that famine is spreading throughout Gaza. As such, we urge Israel to immediately open all available crossings in cooperation with the relevant parties and to take all appropriate measures against looting and divergence. The situation in the West Bank is also extremely concerning. We are appalled that more than 500 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th. We are also alarmed by the provocative rhetoric by Israel's high-level officials calling for harsh punitive measures against the Palestinian Authority, including the approval of additional settlements in the West Bank. We urge Israel to immediately stop all illegal settlement activities. We also appeal for an end to inflammatory movements at holy sites in Jerusalem. Mr. President, the Republic of Korea takes serious note of the order issued by the ICJ on May 24th regarding South Africa's request for additional provisional measures in light of the situation in Rafah. We hope these efforts by the international community can contribute to the protection of Palestinians and an easing of the humanitarian calamity on the ground, as well as the execution of any necessary investigations. The Republic of Korea also reiterates its sincere hope that the diplomatic efforts by the US, Qatar, and Egypt can lead to fruitful outcomes. There is no time to waste. We once again call for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all remaining hostages, and an expansion of humanitarian aid throughout Gaza. We all have to keep in mind that an ongoing catastrophe in Gaza, triggered by Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel on October 7th, would make it impossible to resume any meaningful talks toward a two-state solution. And the failure to relaunch these negotiations would be a serious misfortune for the future of the region and beyond. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their important statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. First, the United Kingdom is appalled by the deeply distressing scenes emerging from Rafah following Israeli airstrikes over the weekend. As the Foreign Secretary has said, we call on Israel to launch a swift, comprehensive, and transparent investigation. The UK's position is very clear. We do not support a major military operation in Rafah without an acceptable plan to protect the hundreds of thousands of civilians who remain there. We have seen no such plan. Hundreds of thousands have already been displaced from Rafah, many for the second time, and to locations without suitable provision of shelter, food, water, and access to medical treatment. We strongly condemn Hamas's actions to put civilians at severe risk by using them as shields. We call on Israel to take care to limit operations to military targets and to minimize harm to civilians and civilian objects in line with international humanitarian law. Second, there is an urgent need to get more aid to the people of Gaza who are in such desperate need. Israel has made a number of commitments in recent weeks to increase the supply of aid, including a commitment to flood Gaza with aid. This included increasing the daily number of trucks of aid entering Gaza to 500, opening Ashdod port to humanitarian aid, and additional crossing points for aid in North Gaza. While we welcome progress towards these commitments, including the delivery from Ashdod port into Gaza of flour by WFP, overall progress has been too slow, and quantities of aid being delivered remain well below these levels. We welcome the agreement between Egypt and Israel to allow UN agencies to deliver aid, but operations in Rafah have increased the need for aid at a time when flows have been reduced by the closure of the Rafah crossing point and reduced deliveries of aid through Kerem Shalom. The humanitarian situation is now catastrophic. We call on Israel urgently to fulfill these commitments, to allow aid in quantity through all crossing points, including Rafah, and also to ensure an environment within Gaza that allows aid to reach those who so desperately need it. This includes an effective deconfliction system to allow humanitarian workers to distribute it safely and supporting the minimum operating requirements of the UN and its agencies. Finally, President, all of this could stop now if Hamas laid down their arms. They are causing this suffering to the Palestinian people. We call on Hamas to immediately release all of the hostages that have now been held for over 7 months. We urgently need to see a deal which stops the fighting, allows for unhindered access for life-saving aid into Gaza, and gets the hostages out. We must then work with our international partners to turn that pause into a sustainable, permanent ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the important statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Mr. Thor Wennesland for his insightful briefing. His remarks are a sobering reminder of the dire situation across the entire occupied Palestinian territories, including Gaza, including the West Bank, including Al-Quds al-Sharif. This grim reality reflects the brutal and senseless nature of the Israeli occupation. In recent months, this very council and the international community have focused predominantly on the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. However, it is crucial to remember that the original sin of this suffering is the ongoing occupation, the ongoing oppression. Addressing the symptoms without tackling the root cause, I mean the occupation of Palestinian land, will not lead to lasting peace. The suffering of the Palestinian people began with the occupation, and it will only end when the occupation is over. In this regard, the Security Council bears primary responsibilities and must fully implement its relevant resolutions. Resolution 2334, for instance, clearly states that settlements are illegal and constitute a flagrant violation of international law. Despite this, around 800,000 settlers currently reside illegally in the West Bank, making life a nightmare for Palestinians. The Israeli occupying authorities have just proposed building 10,000 new housing units, and they are allocating additional funds for this settlement without being sanctioned by the Security Council. Furthermore, the occupying power continues its policy of demolishing Palestinian houses and structures, with over 470 demolitions since January 1st, 2024. They persist in their effort to Judaize Al-Quds and its holy seat. We have recently witnessed assault by settlers on Al-Aqsa Mosque and on Sheikh Jarrah area. These actions risk exacerbating tensions and further escalating the situation. Mr. President, this dark reality in the West Bank and Al-Quds Sharif is compounded by the situation in Gaza. Needless to recall figures, the human cost is self-evident and appalling. These crimes speak for themselves. Haunting images from Gaza floats our screens all over the world. If they don't steer the spirit of humanity in all of us, then words will be useless. Mr. President, upon instruction of the President of the Republic, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, Algeria, as a responsible member of the Security Council, and with the support of the Arab group, has decided to submit a draft resolution urging everyone in this council to shoulder its responsibilities. We hope that this concise draft resolution can gather the support of everyone in this council. We need a united council. We need a unified council, because waiting for the occupying power to voluntarily abide by international law and Security Council resolution is pointless. The occupation authority have made it clear they will not comply with the orders of the International Court of Justice. Instead, they continue to cover up murders and commit what they say tragic mistakes. This very Security Council is responsible under Article 94/4 of the Charter to ensure the implementation of the decisions of the ICG. We demand that the Council assume its legal responsibilities. Mr. President, the current policies of the occupying power aim to spoil Palestinian aspirations for statehood and self-determination. By depriving Palestinians of their lands, livelihoods, and means of resilience, life in Palestine is becoming unbearable. We are witnessing repeated attacks on UNRWA, an organization vital for aiding Palestinian refugees, I repeat, refugees, and affirming their right to return home. After failing recently to discredit the agency, the occupying authorities have proposed a bill to classify this agency, to classify UNRWA as a terrorist organization and effectively removing it from the occupied territories. We warn against this move and call on the Council to defend this crucial organization for the stability of the Middle East. Amidst the darkness, a glimmer of hope persists thanks to the growing international recognition of the Palestinian states. This recognition, along with Palestine's full membership to the United Nations, is essential for solidifying the right of the Palestinians to establish their independent state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital, in the face of an occupying force determined to annihilate the Palestinian people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their important statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Mozambique. We wish to begin by extending our sincere gratitude to Mr. Tor Wennesland, UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, for his important and insightful briefing. We are deeply saddened by the unprecedented human tragedy that is unfolding in Gaza Strip, home to approximately 2 million residents. At the origin of the tragedy is the Israeli military offensive launched against Gaza, and in particular, at this moment, against the city of Rafah. Despite the chorus of international warnings about the potential for mass casualties in an area where displaced civilians have sought shelter, the military offensive has proceeded, exacerbating what is already a catastrophic humanitarian situation. On May 26, Israel carried out a strike on a camp for displaced people in Rafah. According to Gaza authorities, this attack resulted in the death of dozens of civilian Palestinians, with many more injured, mostly women and children. The resulting global outrage and condemnation from all over the world further enhances Israel's international isolation. We have just concluded in the Council a momentous week devoted to the topic of the protection of civilians. The entire global community warned against the danger of normalizing the attacks on civilians and humanitarian workers. We, on our side, strongly oppose and condemn that trend, and in particular, the ongoing Israeli military operation in Rafah. In that connection, we echo the calls for a global and concerted action for the end of Israel's military operation in Rafah, which is causing untold human suffering of the Palestinian people. These horrendous acts are perpetrated in a blatant violation of all humanitarian norms, against all laws of war and all moral standards. They constitute clearly a grave violation of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law against the Palestinian people. This Security Council has the responsibility to collectively take effective measures in order to stop the operation in Rafah and bring to an end the daily systematic killing of the innocent civilian population in Gaza. We emphasize the binding nature of the resolutions adopted by this Council. In particular, Resolution 2712, 2720, and 2728. These Security Council resolutions are compounded by the orders enacted by International Law Court of Justice in January, March, and May of this year. The decisions of these two United Nations bodies, that's to say, the Security Council and the International Court of Justice, are the solid basis for our collective action. We take this opportunity to call for the immediate implementation of Resolution 2730 we have just adopted regarding the protection of humanitarian and United Nations personnel and their facilities and assets, including here UNRWA, the backbone agency of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian refugees. We express our total condemnation of the crimes that were discovered in the mass graves in the hospitals of Nasser and Al-Shifa in Gaza. We reiterate the urgent need for a credible, independent, impartial investigation to lift the veil that covers the truth about this monstrous crime. We need to abide by the imperative of accountability so that the perpetrators of these heinous crimes are brought to justice. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Security Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the observer state of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. If the Israeli assault stopped today and we decided to hold a funeral every single day for each Palestinian killed in the last 8 months, it would take us 100 years to honor them all. This Council adopted only a week ago a resolution on the protection of UN and humanitarian personnel. It would take us, if we held a funeral a day for these humanitarian personnel, over a year to honor them all. There's barely anything left in Gaza. Israel has destroyed everything. But there is everything left still in Gaza. 2.3 million people who have been in a constant battle with death for the last 8 months. They are victims. They are heroes because they refuse to surrender to death. But they are victims who deserve to be helped as victims, not only admired as heroes. 8 months later, we are yet to tell them that help is on the way. You cannot unhear the screams of a mother who did everything in her power to save her children and failed. Parents who, having lost a child, have to carry the others to safety, not having the time to mourn and finding safety nowhere. Orphans taken care of by the next closest relative until none of them is left. Families wandering the streets, traumatized, aching, desperate, coming from nowhere, heading to nowhere. They are in a no-life's land, trying to get to tomorrow, where it all starts all over again. There are people starving, only a few feet away from aid, and yet unable to reach it. Despite several binding orders by the International Court of Justice in the case of genocide brought forward by South Africa, Israel has made sure that famine sets in, obstructing aid and allowing its destruction by its extremists and settlers. Instead of halting immediately its offensive on Rafah, as ordered by the world's highest court, it has bombed people it had displaced while they were sheltering in tents. The whole world sees that there is no safe zone in Gaza. The world saw Palestinian families, children burnt alive. It is unbearable to see a loved one killed before your eyes. But imagine the pain to see them burnt alive, screaming in agony, to hold a beheaded child in your arms, or pull from this hell their charred corpse. The whole world warned of what an Israeli offensive in Rafah would mean and opposed such an offensive. And yet Israel proceeded with the consequences that you all foresaw: unbearable human suffering. Israel wants Palestinians to understand that if they remain in Gaza, that is their fate, death or displacement. Maybe I should say death and displacement, displacement and death. When will it be enough? What other level of cruelty must be reached before this assault is finally brought to an end? There is no red line imposed by legality, rationality, humanity that Israel has not crossed. It is now crossing the red line set by the entire world on Rafah, and it is the duty of this Council to uphold that red line. Human lives are at stake. To uphold that red line and to take decisive action to force Israel to halt its military offensive and to withdraw its occupation forces and to ensure an immediate ceasefire. The adoption of the draft resolution put forward by Algeria yesterday would be an important step in that direction. Mr. President, the whole world sees the targeting of civilians and indiscriminate attacks against them, the use of starvation as a method of war, the summary executions in the streets, including of people blindfolded and handcuffed. They saw hospitals turned into graveyards, the mass graves. But somehow one should trust Israel when it says it is investigating the conduct of the self-proclaimed, and I quote, most moral army in the world, end quotes. An army committing war crimes on a daily basis. Anyone interested in the truth or in accountability should not be interested in Israel's sham investigations. Israeli investigators and Israeli courts are designed to perpetuate and enable the occupation and its crimes and exactions against the occupied people that Israel as occupying power should be protecting. These are its targets, the people that it should be protecting as an occupying power. They are not designed to achieve accountability. That is why Israel rejects international investigations and fears them. If after bombing 3 different cars of a humanitarian convoy by the world-renowned World Central Kitchen, who had given their coordinates, killing 7 international aid workers, Israel reprimanded and dismissed a couple of officers. That is the measures it has taken. Reprimand and dismiss for the killing and targeting of humanitarian personnel. What chance do Palestinians stand to see one day accountability based on Israeli investigation and decisions? What hope is there for justice? Mr. President, Israel can kill any Palestinian and call them either terrorists or human shields to justify their murder. It uses both terms extremely loosely, so they can cover anyone and everyone. Israel has called any form of opposition to its occupation and its oppression of the Palestinian people terrorism, including defense of human rights, diplomatic action, approaches to judicial institutions to examine its actions. All legal actions have been characterized by Israel as terrorism. Similarly, it considers that it can bomb entire neighborhoods using indiscriminate and massive bombardments and simply say about the thousands of Palestinians it has killed, unfortunately, they were human shields. You have experienced yourselves as council members how loosely Israel uses these terms. As the Israeli representative accused member of the council, the entire UN membership, the Secretary General, the prosecutor of the ICC, of being anti-Semites, supporters of terrorism, collaborators of Nazism, in his usual measured and responsible way. But the difference is that Israel does not decide whether you live or die, but it decides the fate of every Palestinian. You have learned to live with Israel's irrational and racist behavior, but we die because of it. The incitement by the Israeli representatives against the UN has real-life consequences, cannot be tolerated any longer. They signal to their soldiers, to their extremists, that the UN is an enemy and a legitimate target. This explains why this is the deadliest conflict for UN personnel, why they can be arrested and tortured, why the UNRWA headquarters in Jerusalem could be attacked and set ablaze, because of that incitement. Mr. President, what is the most outrageous is that Israel is outraged by the very actions it undertakes as long as it is not the one undertaking them. When it undertakes them, they become justified and defensible. Israel can come here and explain how horrifying it is to see civilians killed in indiscriminate attacks or in the safety of their homes, while obliterating entire Palestinian families at a time. It can come to explain the fear that Israelis feel as they have to shelter when hearing sirens, while it conducts massive bombardments against a Palestinian population that has nowhere to shelter, that doesn't have the energy to fear anymore. It will come to demand action for those held in captivity for the last 7 months, while it has held Palestinians in captivity one generation after another for the last 7 decades. And while there is evidence of it abducting thousands in the last 7 months alone, killing several Palestinians while in detention, and imposing such abuse and ill treatment on others that they had to suffer amputations. It will say how despicable it is to use people as human shields, while it has a long record of using Palestinians as human shields during its military incursions and operations in occupied territory, sometimes placing them in front of its military jeeps while it is making its incursions into our cities and refugee camps. I have heard the Israeli representative here in New York saying that detaining bodies was barbaric, as it deprived the families from the ability to mourn and offer dignified burial to their loved ones. Israel has detained the bodies of hundreds of Palestinians it has killed, sometimes for over 3 decades without being able to bury our loved ones, detained by Israel in graves with numbers instead of their names, so we could not recognize where they are buried. But that is human when Israel does it, not barbaric. Israel accuses many of seeking its destruction, says that all its actions are justified by this existential threat it faces, while it actively and openly pursues the destruction of our country and our people. It expresses outrage at the slogan, "Palestine will be free from the river to the sea," and says that this is a genocidal call, while its own prime minister not only has repeatedly used the phrase "Israel from the river to the sea," but held a map at the General Assembly podium where Israel was from the river to the sea and Palestine had disappeared altogether. And he is acting accordingly on the ground, including by committing a genocide in Gaza and pursuing colonization of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. It's not words, it's actions. It wants occupation and violent oppression for Palestinians and peace and security for itself. It does not understand what is the big deal, why the world fails to support it in achieving this absurd goal. Occupation, oppression for Palestinians, peace and security for Israel. Why not? Certainly, Israel explains the lack of support by anti-Semitism. Not because what Israel wants is illegal, immoral, goes against every fiber of human decency you can have in your body. Never mind that experience has proven it is impossible to achieve. It keeps invoking the Holocaust and its 6 million victims to justify its crimes, forgetting that the greatest lesson of the Holocaust is that war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide can never be justified, never, and must always be combated, regardless of the identity of the victims and the identity of the perpetrators. No civilian should be harmed, regardless of their nationality, their origin, their religion, their race. They're all irrelevant. They should be protected. So, given Israel's mindset, it is logical that this Israeli government would interpret the recognition of the state of Palestine by Spain, Ireland, and Norway as somehow an attack against Israel. Never mind the fact that these countries have recognized Israel decades ago without asking for anyone's approval. That was not unilateral when they recognized Israel. It becomes a unilateral move when they recognize the state of Palestine. Never mind that they advocate a two-state solution, where Palestine lives side by side with Israel, where Palestinians and Israelis live in peace and security. Never mind that these countries have all a strong record in their support for international law and just peace. Never mind that the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination, including to the independence of their state, and that Israel cannot be allowed to have a veto right over these rights for the Palestinian people. How did Israel respond? By promising more criminality. More criminality, colonization, breaching the historic status quo at Al-Haram al-Sharif, stealing our money. A state that behaves that manner. It's because they've been above the law for so long that they have no problem acting as an outlaw state. We thank the 3 countries for their important decision in support of freedom and peace, as we thank Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Bahamas, and all the countries that made a similar choice over the years, and call on all the countries that have yet to recognize the state of Palestine to do so as an investment in freedom and an investment in peace in these tragic times. We also thank all the countries which supported the membership of the state of Palestine in the UN. That day is coming, where we will be members in the United Nations and free. How is it possible that Israel cannot see how absurd its position is, how evident its selective outrage is? Because it considers us subhumans. Or let me use the words of the Israeli leaders. human animals. Ethnic cleansing, apartheid, genocide across history have always been made possible by dehumanizing a nation, and that is what is happening here. They have been dehumanizing us for so long that they don't understand your indignation when Palestinians are killed. They don't understand what's the issue. Why are they being brought here to discuss that matter? They do not understand how anyone can, despite the historical record, speak of historical injustice against the Palestinian when speaking of our fate. Why anyone would decide to recognize our existence as a people, our rights as a nation, and our state. They do not understand how anyone can dare equate between their civilians and our civilians, because our civilians are less civilians than their civilians. We are lesser human beings. That is the equivalence they truly reject when they speak of the ICC. That is the equivalence that annoys them, that Palestinian victims could be considered victims, forgetting that the court's responsibility is towards the victims, not the perpetrators. They want for Palestinian victims to be left with no protection and for Israeli perpetrators to continue being shielded. And that is unacceptable, and everyone should say so. Israel trusts that it will get away with its crimes. Why? Because of 75 years of experiencing full-fledged impunity. Any statement that reinforces that feeling of somehow being a state above the law, being entitled to an exceptional status, will only encourage Israel to continue acting as an outlaw state. This must be a time for accountability. If after Gaza there is no accountability, if after a genocide we don't have accountability, when will we have it? And does anyone believe that if Israel's impunity is preserved, they will change course? They will wake up one day and say, yes, we want to have peace with the Palestinians. That is the reasonable choice to make. That's not how it will happen. Each and every state can make the colonial occupation costly and thus contribute to bringing it to an end. Tomorrow's freedom and peace will be made possible by the decisions you take today. Allow us to tell our people who are suffering unbearable pain that help is on the way, and that this nightmare, this hell on earth will end, and that this solidarity they see in every corner of the globe will translate into resolute action to stop this genocide, achieve freedom, and advance peace. There is no objective more worthy, there is no time more pressing, there is no greater responsibility. Finally, Palestinians should no longer have to die and suffer to remain on their land. Life in freedom and dignity in our homeland. That is our simple dream that must prevail over the nightmare imposed on our people for so long.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. This Council has now convened for the umpteenth time to discuss the just and moral war Israel is fighting against the bloodthirsty, genocidal terror organization of Hamas. Yet again, just as has been the case for the past nearly 8 months, the Council still refrains from convening on Hamas and laying the blame where it belongs, on the shoulders of terrorists. This war began with Hamas carrying out the most heinous atrocities wrought upon Israelis in history, and it continues because the very same terrorists are still holding 125 innocent hostages in Gaza, while continuing to fire rockets on Israel's towns and cities, even from with designated humanitarian areas in the south of Gaza. Hamas has sworn to commit the horrors of October 7th again and again, until Israel is annihilated, and we are fighting this war to ensure that these atrocities can never be repeated. This war against terror is not just Israel's right as a sovereign nation, but our obligation and duty. Each and every member of this Council will do the same, because this is what countries do to protect their futures. But instead of focusing on the facts, the Council prefers to do anything it can to end this war, even if that means endangering Israel's security. Israel has been very clear from the outset. This war can end today without one more shot being fired. All that is required is for Hamas to release the hostages and put down their arms. These are our conditions, and we're not asking for anything more. But the reality is that Hamas refuses these terms. Hamas chooses to hold innocents hostage. Hamas chooses to continue firing rockets. Hamas chooses to exploit the civilians of Gaza as human shields. The terrorists chose to terrorize, and as a result, they must be held fully accountable. Yet sadly, the Council chooses to place the blame where it does not belong. Instead of echoing Israel's demands and holding the terrorists responsible, this Council chooses to convene almost weekly, even bi-weekly at this point, to hold Israel accountable for a war we did not choose or want. Such behavior is perhaps not surprising for an organization that eulogizes mass murderers. That the General Assembly will convene tomorrow to lament the death of a dictator that butchered his own citizens speaks volumes. Colleagues, if Hamas refuses to release our hostages and surrender, then we have only one option: to bring the hostages home ourselves and eliminate Hamas's terrorist capabilities. And this is what we have to continue to do. There are still 4 Hamas battalions in Rafah, and many of our hostages are being held there. Hundreds of terror shafts to tunnels have been discovered, while tens of Hamas terrorists have been eliminated. And I wish to also point out that Israel recently returned the bodies of murdered hostages to their families, bodies found in an UNRWA facility in Gaza. In order to accomplish our mission, we have no choice but to root out the terrorists in southern Gaza. This is why we conducted the precise strike on Sunday, targeting and eliminating 2 senior Hamas terror officials with the blood of many on their hands, Israelis and others. Israel's war is only against Hamas and terror organizations, not the people of Gaza. And every strike or advance is carried out after extensive verification to mitigate any civilian casualties. The strike on Sunday took place nearly 2 kilometers from the designated humanitarian zone, and the loss of civilian lives followed the strike is being thoroughly investigated. Preliminary findings indicate the fire broke out due to secondary explosions from terror munitions stored near the civilians. Where are the condemnations of Hamas for using Gazans as human shields and civilian sites as weapon depots? The loss of life on Sunday is a tragedy, but it is Hamas who must be held accountable. The Council must face the facts on the ground without being influenced by the half-truths and falsehoods portrayed in the media and through biased reports. There is a concerted effort to rewrite the truth and falsely paint Israel as the root of all evil, and this cannot be tolerated. South Africa failed yet again in its cynical attempts to exploit the ICJ in order to undermine Israel's inherent right and obligation to defend its citizens from the ongoing Hamas attacks and to secure the release of hostages still being held in Gaza in brutal captivity. The charges leveled at Israel are false and morally repugnant. Israel is fighting a defensive and just war, and every action taken is consistent with moral values and is in compliance with international law. Israel has not and will not conduct military actions in the Rafah area which may inflict on the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. This is our moral code, and these are the facts. Colleagues, I will reiterate, Israel is fighting a war against Hamas and not the civilians of Gaza. This is why Israel is committed to facilitating the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza from every possible point of entry. Despite Hamas rocket fire on the Kerem Shalom crossing, it is fully functional and aid trucks are entering. Israel is fully committed to ensuring the entry of as much aid as possible. Mr. President, it is imperative that the Council upholds its mandate. Stop accepting the lies of terrorists as facts. Stop emboldening those that seek Israel's annihilation. Stop parroting politically charged falsehoods designated to bash Israel. There is only one way for this conflict to be resolved, and standing blindly with one side while demonizing the other is not how to advance a solution. And is surely not conducive to bilaterally recognize a Palestinian state following the most brutal massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. Such steps only serve to reward terrorism and embolden the Palestinians, that solutions can be found with no negotiations and zero concessions. This is not the road to peace. It is the road to further terror, bloodshed, and destruction. Israel is fighting not only on behalf of our hostages, not only on behalf of our security, but on behalf of all civilization. Stop taking the side of terrorism. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, South Africa wishes to thank you and members of the Security Council for giving us an opportunity to address the Council at this meeting today. We also thank Special Coordinator Tor Venesland for his briefing. The Security Council is convening yet again to discuss the perilous situation in the Middle East. We can remind the members of the Security Council that the situation in Palestine and Israel has been on its agenda for almost as long as this organization is in existence. We can remind Council members of their charter-mandated role to maintain international peace and security. We can remind Council members that a failure to decisively act to contribute to preventing and stopping wars will result in more people dying, being injured, and living in intolerable conditions. Mr. President, how many times does the Council have to be reminded of these matters before it can meaningfully act to make a call that it is duty-bound to make, a call for a ceasefire? That is what the majority of members of the United Nations and thousands of people all across the world have been demanding for months. A call for a ceasefire so that we can halt the senseless killing of thousands of civilians, including innocent children, women, and men. The response from this Council to this call has not been entirely forthcoming. The legally binding resolution calling for a short-lived ceasefire in Ramadan was ignored, and the Council has not acted accordingly. Mr. President, in December 2023, noting its obligations as a state party to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, South Africa approached the International Court of Justice seeking an order to prevent Israel from committing genocide against Palestinian people. As Israel continued to defy the court's orders, including with its latest Rafah offensive, South Africa went back to the court seeking additional provisional measures to prevent Israel's persistent acts of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. And contrary to what we've just heard from the representative of Israel, in its decisions, the court has asserted that the Palestinians have a legal right to protection against genocide, and that South Africa had shown that there was a real and imminent risk to the irreparable violation of that right. The ICJ's orders make it clear that there is a serious risk of genocide against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Third states must therefore also act independently and immediately to prevent genocide by Israel and to ensure that they are not themselves in violation of the Genocide Convention, including by aiding or assisting in the commission of genocide. This necessarily imposing an obligation on all states to cease funding and facilitating Israel's military actions, which are plausibly genocidal. We regret that since the provisional measures were issued by the court, including its latest decision on 10 May 2024, where it ordered Israel to halt any other actions in Rafah, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza the conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Palestinians continue to suffer immeasurably under the occupying power's intensified military operations. The events of the past 7 months in Gaza have illustrated that Israel's actions are plausibly genocidal and are contrary to its international law obligations, including those in terms of the Genocide Convention. Mr. President, today in a letter addressed to you, which we request you to circulate to the members of the Security Council, South Africa has provided the Council with a public dossier of evidence relating to the state of Israel's intent and incitement to commit genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. We remind members of the Council that Article 94.2 of the UN Charter states that if any party to a case fails to perform the obligations incumbent upon it under a judgment rendered by the ICJ, the other party may have recourse to the Security Council, which may, if it deems necessary, make recommendations or decide upon measures to be taken to give effect to the judgment. South Africa therefore requests the Security Council to give effect to the court's judgments in the case of South Africa versus Israel. We keep saying it, and we reiterate it today, that the international community cannot proclaim the importance of international law and the importance of the UN Charter in some situations and not in others, as if the rule of law applies to a select few. For international law to be credible, it should be uniformly applied and not selective. Mr. President, the global governance system that was created for states to voluntarily join and commit to working collectively to address global challenges requires us to accept that no one is beyond reproach. No one state is more equal to another. No one state can be allowed to breach international law and at the same time call on others to abide by it. As you approach the Summit of the Future and consider the future of this organization and the challenges facing multilateralism as a whole, let us accept that when we sign on and accept to be part of the United Nations, we accept to be bound by its rules. This should especially be noted by those that seek leadership positions with this organization. I thank you.
I thank the representative of South Africa for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, I would like to deliver this statement on behalf of the Arabic Group and would thank the Special Coordinator, Toon Wensland, for his briefing, which highlighted the catastrophic conditions caused by Israel's war against the Gaza Strip. The attacks on the camps of the displaced people in Rafah since the beginning of this week are unspeakable and require explicit condemnation from the entire international community. The heinous massacre committed by the Israeli occupation forces last Sunday against hundreds of civilians while they were sleeping in their tents, in addition to the Al-Mawasi massacre yesterday, are merely the latest episodes in the series of systematic war crimes against the Palestinian people. Mr. President, there are no words to describe the horror of children killed by fire, or phrases that can express the shock of a mother holding the remains of her burned infant. No language can describe the cries of pain of a crippled old man taking his last breath amid the burning tents. These bloody attacks came less than 2 days after the ICJ issued new provisional measures demanding Israel to immediately stop its military operations in Rafah. This came after more than 900,000 Palestinians were displaced during the past 2 weeks, or more than 60% of the displaced people in Rafah, due to Israel's escalation of its aggression against the governorate of Rafah, forcing many of them to flee again, seeking a safe place from this Israeli war. However, after nearly 8 months of bombing, killing, abuse, and displacement, there is no longer a safe or livable place in Gaza. Every area that was called a safe zone has been targeted, and everything that is considered protected under international humanitarian law has been violated. The tragedy of repeated displacement is just one aspect of the suffering endured by these displaced people, as they suffer from a total absence of water, food, and sanitary materials, especially when Israel closed the Rafah crossing and banned humanitarian aid from entering. All this happens while the Gaza Strip is suffering from famine. Israel has persistently and deliberately crossed all red lines and is blatantly and unequivocally defying international law and the resolutions of this council. Additionally, Israel has for the third time ignored the provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice. The eyes of the world today are not only directed at Rafah, but also at this body responsible for maintaining international peace and security. Such violations require a firm and clear response from the Security Council. When the United Nations was founded on the ruins of 2 devastating world wars, member states vowed to save future generations from the scourge of war. Your esteemed Council bears the primary responsibility to fulfill this pledge. Where are the people of Gaza in this pledge? What is happening in the Gaza Strip undoubtedly shows the true face of war and the atrocities it inflicts on innocent people. The Arab group calls on this council to positively and constructively engage in the negotiations related to the draft resolution put forward by the state of Algeria yesterday. The draft resolution aims to stop the Israeli military attack on Rafah and demands an immediate ceasefire. In this regard, we stress the importance of adopting this resolution, as the Security Council has been very late in taking such an urgent step. Ending this war, which has been described by the United Nations as war against children, has become an urgent demand indeed. During this war, we have seen repeated massacres targeting hospitals, aid distribution points, children, and other innocent people. We have also seen Israel kill humanitarian, medical, and media personnel, along with the elderly, women, and children. Additionally, Israeli bombings have targeted health centers, schools, camps, bakeries, mosques, churches, universities, and the UN facilities. We note here that targeting civilians constitutes a war crime whose perpetrators must be held accountable before the law. The double standards have become as clear as the sun, and its repercussions will not only destabilize our region, but also the entire world. Therefore, the Arab group stresses the importance of uniform and equal implementation of international law and international humanitarian law without any exception or discrimination. Implementation of Security Council resolutions should not be selective or based on double standards. Israel, like any other state, is required to respect its obligations under these international legal frameworks and to stop its illegal actions against the Palestinians. This must include the West Bank, where tensions are rising to dangerous levels due to the accelerated pace of building settlements, land confiscation, and almost daily raids on Palestinian cities and camps. Not to mention the ongoing raids by the Israeli extremists against Al-Aqsa Mosque under the protection of the Israeli occupation police and prohibiting the worshippers from entering the mosque. This constitutes a flagrant violation of international law and the existing historical and legal status of Jerusalem and its sanctities. The oppression imposed on the Palestinians has no limits, and it can blow up the situation in the region to uncontrollable levels at any moment. In conclusion, the Arab group renews its demand for this council to take firm steps to end the war in Gaza and to ensure immediate and unobstructed entry of humanitarian aid to save what can be saved. The group also stresses the need for taking immediate action before it's too late. In this context, we appreciate the vigorous efforts of the Arab Republic of Egypt and the State of Qatar to reach a ceasefire agreement and alleviate the suffering in Gaza. This dangerous juncture in the history of this conflict makes it imperative for the Security Council and the international community to make all possible efforts to save the two-state solution and the occupation, stop violence, establish security and stability in the region, and achieve an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders, in accordance with the relevant UN resolutions, international law, and the UN Charter. Achieving just and lasting peace also requires strong support for the full membership of the State of Palestine in the United Nations and recognizing it as well. Many countries have recently recognized the Palestinian state, and we highly value their support for the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. So this meeting is adjourned.